وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Allahumma ameen. We begin with the name of Allah. We praise Allah. We thank Allah for giving us the ability, the strength, the heart, and the intellect to be able to inquire about Him and to know Him and to worship Him and to strive to live under His divine gaze and to live for His divine pleasure, His love, and His mercy. And we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as all things come from Him. That is both the sacred and the secular, the sacred and the secular, I should say. And we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He made His religion a religion of knowledge, such that even the weekly obligatory prayer is a place of knowledge. It's on a minbar where someone speaks for 30 minutes about knowledge. And this is something to be absolutely indebted to Allah for. And I begin with that because it is something absolutely fundamental to religious vitality. And, just like we talked about Rawls last week, this idea that what he considers to be a comprehensive doctrine of good is a reasonable doctrine, and so the fact that Muslims can clearly say that their doctrine is a reasonable one, right, is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to be thanked for. So inshallah ta'ala, I will start by addressing this idea that Fawaz mentioned, and then we'll get into some other ideas. And this will be good because it will function as a kind of review of last week as well, and we can start to get the intellectual juices flowing, inshallah ta'ala. So let's start there. So Fawaz, you mentioned that Muslims should start to see themselves, right, as, in a sense, not only, right, a religion, but kind of a way of being, right, a culture. And Dr. Sherman Jackson does mention this. He mentions a quote, and I'm sure I can find it in 5 seconds, and if I do not, then I'll move on. Okay. But he mentions that there's a quote, I forget on which page, where he specifically mentions, forget it, a Jewish philosopher of religion, and she specifically says that we saw being Jewish, right, as, as an identity, as a culture, and a religion, right? And this is something for us to think about, especially because we're not bound to words, right? This is an important idea, that we are not bound to words, we're bound to meaning, right? And words are a way to communicate meanings. But words can never totally encompass meanings, right? That's why we struggle to explain things. We struggle to articulate what we're feeling in a given moment, right? And that's why we have the concept of reading between the lines. And this also is true for the Quran. As we say, the Quran is, right, Kitab al-Mastur wa Kitab al-Mandur, right? That the Quran is a book to be read, and it's also a book to be experienced, right? That the Quran will say, أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبْلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ, right? Don't they go and see how the camel was created. That's an experience that you have to go and actually investigate the subtleties of the camel to see divine wisdom, right? So this idea is an important idea, that we always are meaning oriented. And this allows us to escape some of the traps of ignorance, which is to just get triggered by this word and that word. And all right, cool. So basically, last time let's see if this works. Definitely not. Too late. Let's see if this works. Right, so we said this is politics, right? And that's one of the reasons why, of all the doctrines of liberalism, why we're working with Rawls is because he's the one who believes that liberalism is a political doctrine, right? That it governs the politics of a nation, but not everything, right? So he believes in maintaining the vitality of other non-liberal doctrines, right? So you should always ask yourself, why, for instance, is a church or a mosque tax exempt, right? Why would the government take money out of their pockets and into religious organizations' pockets, right? That is because they believe religion as an institution is good for society, right? That it is the ethical engine of a good populace. And so that's the reason why Fadl, Dr. Muhammad Fadl, and Dr. Sherman Jackson, to some extent, that is why they like to key in on Rawls. He is the most reasonable of liberal doctrines, essentially. So we said basically that, right, you're going to have all of these doctrines, and these doctrines are going to exist around the political sphere. So when Muslims, right, so let's say this is Islam here. Muslims who adopt liberalism proper, right, which is secularization. When I say liberalism proper, that's also because that's based on a definition. But Muslims who adopt secularization, one of the byproducts of that is private religion. So religion is not a public phenomenon, it is one that's lived right in the heart, right? And anyone that essentially adopts religion, they're doing it out of absolute consent and autonomy, right? That even free of influence. When I say consent, I mean absolute consent, in the sense that you cannot even attempt to influence someone towards religion, not just permission, right? So let me be clear. There's a difference between permission, that is the technical understanding of consent, is that I get your permission, but I'm still free to attempt to influence you. right? Whereas private religion and the doctrine of private religion and the process of secularization would dictate that even your own children, right, you would not be able to influence them, because that is a form of stripping autonomy, right, which is the ultimate goal of liberalism, that everyone can, right, as long as they're not harming others. So when you take away the ability for a human being to want, or you try to influence their ability to construct their own wants, right, you are stripping them of autonomy. So if Muslims were to adopt private religion in the way it's used today, what would happen is that this circle here, the comprehensive doctrine as a whole, would get smaller and smaller and smaller. Oh, where's the eraser? That the doctrine, right, would get smaller until it ceased to exist, right? So even in Rawls' conception of liberalism, what you're going to find is that Rawls is relying upon non-liberal doctrines, or what we could call comprehensive doctrines of good. He's relying on them to live publicly, right? He is relying on them not to do this. He's relying on them to live publicly. So if you want to influence politics, or we shouldn't say politics, we should say plausibility structure, right? And we mentioned what plausibility, we talked for a great extent about what plausibility structure was. But just to be clear, here we go. That's why I love whiteboards. All of this, don't even read it. Just all of this constructs what is plausible for society, right? It is what a human being considers to be true, considers to be normal, considers to be good, right? And last week we asked the question that if I were to say, is Islam, right? Do people believe that Islam could offer a solution to society, or that it could even possibly be true, right? Immediately all of us would say no, right? That's because Islam is no longer in the plausibility structure of liberal society, right? And that can be due to many things, but I would say probably primarily it's due to the failed infrastructures of the Arab and I could say the Muslim world in general. But it's also due to, propaganda. It's also due to the war on terror, right? That all of these things contribute to an idea that Islam is not a plausible doctrine. And I would say also that Christianity is reaching a point where it's no longer considered to be plausible, right? Which is why you have droves of Christians leaving church. They no longer consider it to be a plausible concept. And so religion as a whole, right, in the latest kind of formation of plausibility is almost completely removed, right? And the only remnant of plausibility that is left, right, is what we call kind of moral therapeutic deism, right? Which is that basically something that tells you to be a good person, something that gives you some type of therapeutic idea so that you can make it through some pain that you're going through, right? That is the only type of plausible form of religion that lives today in the general mind of human beings. right?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So is this where the concept of neoliberalism comes into place? Because what you said was that in liberalism, somebody like Rawls wants comprehensive doctrines like Islam, Christianity to actually play its place in society because they think it's good. But now it sounds like they can only play its place if it meets certain parameters and works within a certain system.
Well, look it. We have to identify the difference between political liberalism and liberalism as a phenomena in society, right? And that's what we call secularization, right? So there are phenomena in society that are creating concepts like this. And then there's Rawls trying to create a political theory that can allow people to agree, right? And so basically what Rawls is just trying to do is say, you guys don't agree on theology, but we can all agree that we should ban cocaine. And that's literally what one of the examples Dr. Jackson gives. We all agree that we should ban cocaine, right? So he's just trying to give a kind of a systematic way for us to live peacefully, in a sense, which is fair and good, and we generally would agree with that. But here, what's happening over here, this is where the problems are really forming. And Dr. Jackson, though, he's saying, though, this institution as a whole is going to, just by merit of existing, is going to feed into this. So he's positing that even if we are to say, hey, Rawls is great, it still would not be enough to resist what's happening here. So the only way for Muslims to remain plausible, or to even be plausible, is they absolutely have to reject this private religion. They have to live as public as possible, right? And we obviously have our own discourses within that, like, should we be on social media, and like, should we be? Those are like small fish. When we say public, we mean something much bigger than that. That we're engaged in the development of social vehicles of the next century, right? That we are developing the social infrastructure of society, of civilization, right? And that is done through culture. So that's kind of, when we talk about religion, what we're talking about here being more than a religion. When we talk about being more than a religion, what we're talking about is that we want this circle to keep getting bigger, right? And that's not just going to be done through like praying together. It's going to be done, right? And it's not going to be done by just waxing academic either, right? That means, contributing to culture. So we could say, for instance, if you have like thought here, but you have arts, right? You have music, you have activism, right? That this idea that how do we make our presence irresistible, right? And this can be done like rather disingenuously, but there's also a kind of very genuine way to approach that, which is like, we believe Islam has something to offer to people. Whether you become Muslim or not is not the scope of our address. It's that we think we can help your life, right? And whether it's your dunya or your afterlife, right? Whether it's your worldly life or your afterlife, that we believe we have something to offer, and we want to live our values out loud, right? And the mosque, because the article is about the impact of the mosque, right? The mosque is a very public form of religion, right? And we're going to need to start talking about the impact of the mosque, especially right here, the most obvious of them being the idea of private religion. And it's important, just as Dr. Jackson mentions, differentiation. It's important for us to differentiate with many of these ideas that are within Islam. Because someone could say, well, Islam supports private religion, right? La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. Or they could say, illa man atallaha biqalbin salim. That, that the successful person is the one who comes to God with a pure heart. It's an internal reality. It's not a public one, right? What matters is your intention, not your action. It's an internal reality, not a public one. Or someone could say, يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ, right? That on the day of judgment, human beings, family members will literally run away from each other, right? So it's a private affair, that everyone will come to God. Everyone will come to God as an individual, right? So you can see that it's very easy for Muslims to capture certain concepts from within the tradition to say, you know what? Absolutely right. Private religion, right? And so it's very important for Muslims to resist that temptation, to resist that inclination, although all of those things are true. All of those things are true, but we have to understand that Islam as a doctrine is entirely communal, right? So Islam balances the idea of private religion, but then mandates a great level of community, and we can see that in basically all of our rituals. Even something like prayer, which is the most intimate, the most private of realities, is something that is better done in congregation. In fact, 27 times better, right? So what is God saying to us by saying your prayer with people is 27 times better? He's saying that I'm going to take your most intimate, most sacred act, and I want you to be able to do it with other people. But I want you to maintain that level of privacy at the same time, right? And that's why someone can literally be praying with hundreds of people, but their heart is expanding and shattering, and they're experiencing, just as the Quran says, all of these physiological phenomena, like their hair, standing up, and their eyes tearing, and their heart racing, right? That this idea that someone could be amongst hundreds of people, but experiencing, the most private and individual experience. So in that sense, we say that, one of the great vehicles that is going to maintain the vitality of Islam is in fact the mosque. But if Muslims embrace this type of secularization, not just private religion, but also the idea that I'm not responsible. I'm not responsible. Someone else is, right? And this comes up in the article that basically when we look at, let me just stay on this side. When we look at individualism, right, is functioning on a plane where it's saying, look it, the happiness of X does not equal the happiness of Q, right? That one person's happiness does not lead to another person's happiness. So therefore, the scope of doctrine, the scope of societal doctrine must always be on the individual, right? Whereas the idea of a collective is that if the whole, right, is functioning properly, then this would lead to the happiness of X and Q and Y and Z, right? That the whole does in fact, as they say, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? We would affirm that the health of the collective does in fact lead to the health of the individual. And so we know, in fact, that because Islam is a reasonable doctrine, it actually does balance these things. And that's why we have the concept of fard ayn and fard kifaya, right? That we have the concept that there are individual obligations and then there are communal obligations, right? And maybe you don't have to do it, but somebody has to do it. But even that iteration of fard kifaya supposes that nobody wants to do it, right? And that you kind of got stuck with it because nobody else stepped up, right? It supposes that, the mosque or these types of public institutions is not something desirable, it's just something needed. And so we just keep on kicking the ball around, right? And then you're just like, oh, I'm stuck with it. And that is a product of individualism, right? That Muslims are all being indoctrinated by individualism, but because they understand that there is some sense of collectiveness, and if we're not going to do it, then nobody's going to do it, and so here we are. And that's problematic, right? And that's really something that has to change. If we're talking about the impact of the mosque, is that how do we create cultures where human beings all recognize, right? Or we should say Muslims, when it comes to the mosque, and human beings in the general sense, all understand their indebtedness to the collective and understand that they should want to be with the collective, right? Not just like, hey, this is where I found myself, but if it was up to me, I'd be on a beach in Hawaii, right? That how do we get to developing culture? And that's, and I don't know where we're at, 12:45. I guess we'll stop and take questions in a sec. That's where this whole ideas needs to be answered. That how can Muslims overcome this? It has to be done through culture, right? So culture will allow Muslims to live above the indoctrination of liberalism as we mentioned, as a societal phenomenon. And so there's some questions to be asked, and maybe we'll, inshallah ta'ala, we'll do a course in the future on usul al-bid'ah, because one of the main inhibitors of culture for Muslims is the fact that they fear that everything they do is an innovation. Everything, this is bid'ah and that's bid'ah and this. So when you create that culture of fear, that I'm somehow, if I were to do this, that I'm somehow changing God's religion or changing, the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu then you'll have basically a group of people who, because they can't agree upon kind of a cultural iteration of Islam in America, end up just doing the absolute basics of existence, right? Of religious existence. So when you come to a mosque, right, without culture, what can you do? You can pray, you can eat, you can attend a lecture or a class, right? And that is because those are the only things that Muslims can agree on for culture, right? But is that going to actually sustain Islam, right, in this liberal reality, right? The answer is no, right? Was that a hand? Okay. All right, we'll stop and ask questions. So I'm going to stop there because, there's a lot of things. I don't want to go too deep in this because that's like a whole class on it. That's not just a whole class. I mean like a whole, that's like a proper class we could teach at the Garden of Knowledge if we wanted to. So, okay, I'm going to stop there and let's ask some questions or not. That is a great question. Let's see if it says. Does anyone want to look it up? I don't really see. Yeah, I don't see anything that indicates when it was written. But I would say there's a good chance that it was written at least 5 years ago. Yeah. Yes. All right. Cool. Does everyone understand plausibility structure? It's very important. Okay. Excellent. Yo.
Specifically on the topic of you're mentioning of individualism,
Yes.
people doing good or understanding that there's good to be done for others, even if it doesn't necessarily benefit oneself. How can you how does one motivate or root others into doing that kind of work without a core understanding, for instance, of an afterlife or a sense of reward beyond the immediate? I feel like that's a conversation I often have.
So, how do human beings resolve to be altruistic without motivation, without religious motivation? So basically, how does a Western secular arrive at altruism? Is that what you're asking?
So if people, how do they arrive at altruism if they don't have religious motivation and they don't have some kind of sense of oh, this is my purpose? I feel like even meeting people who don't have either of those things, either they don't have a religious motivation or they don't see it as this is my purpose in some kind of in whatever way they see it for themselves, that they will often not
feel any need or any desire to want to, be altruistic.
Okay. Yeah, so I think there is one important distinction, is that there there's a there is a spectrum of human beings, secular beings, that we have to kind of understand before we answer that question, which is like if you're looking at modern human beings, as in like 1950s, 60s, 70s baby boomers, even if they are secular, they were raised in a non-secular environment, right? So they might have attributes of, the sense of community, the sense of collective, even though they don't have the theology necessarily to back it. And then secondly, I would say the general inclination of the human being is to reciprocate. So they might be able to reciprocate, right? So if they've witnessed some good in their life, right, that they would be able to kind of reciprocate that good. But the kind of higher qualities of religion, such as forgiveness, right, such as unconditional love and mercy and etc., right, those would be difficult. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in the slander of Aisha, right, he even struggles with that I'm providing monetarily for this human being who has slandered my own daughter, and God expects me to keep providing for him because what? And he says, do you not wish, right, for God to forgive you? Would you not love for God to forgive you? So this idea that even people of absolute transcendence would even struggle with something that difficult. And so there are definitely levels to morality. And I would say that Islam not only is calling to morality, but it's calling to transcendent morality. But the general way of people is that all people are able to reciprocate. So if they live in a society that is constantly showing them goodness, that they will be able to exist in that state. And that's why we said, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? So if you put someone in a good house with a good car, with a good job, and with groceries, and in a nice little suburb with safety and security, etc., that it would be reasonable to expect that they would reciprocate those good surroundings. The other thing is that, there's urf, right? So if there's urf, there's a custom, then there's reason to expect that all human beings would follow that custom unless they have a reason not to. So if everyone in the neighborhood is cutting their grass, there's reason to expect that most people would go and cut their grass. The problem, though, those are those individuals. So we talked about people who are raised with those types of customs and in those circumstances. But now I think it's also important to talk about, the current generations that are coming up, which in my estimation are actually far more lethargic than the prior generations. As in to say, someone who's not religious would still find it absolutely disgusting that a human being could sit and watch Netflix for 10 hours, right? They would need to, regardless of their understanding of the afterlife, they would need to get up and do something. And I don't know if you guys have had neighbors before, maybe you have, or interacted with neighbors, but there are plenty of people who are secular that if you live, in a neighborhood with them, you'll find that it's incredible. They just are always up and up, mowing the lawn, cutting things, fixing things, cleaning things, right? And it's not a religious motivation, but it's an understanding of that life is to be lived, right? And they're not acclimated to playing video games for 5 hours or watching TV or whatever. So and they also were not um, they were not raised in a world where people took the doctrines that we're talking about and created systems that express those indoctrinations, right? So we could say, for instance, utility, which is literally to maximize, or we could say hedonism. Utility and hedonism go hand in hand. One is more focused on benefit, the other one is more focused on pleasure, but they eventually become kind of synonymous with each other. This idea that, whether it's on the phone or whether it's on TV or whether it's on this idea that I'm going to give you tools that are going to help you maximize your pleasure, right, in any given moment. And I'm going to make it so it's very difficult to choose anything over pleasure. And so you could say that, yeah, the grandma down the street is very generous. She's always making pies and stopping by and saying hi and going for walks. And we could say that. But the great grandchildren of that grandmother, right, may be so invested in attaining pleasure that they would never make those same decisions. Whereas if a principle and a doctrine that's transcendent will allow human beings to transcend those pleasure traps until the end of time, because it's rooted in principle, right? It's rooted and anchored in God, who is timeless, right? So we could say that Western secular individuals are capable of great levels of ethics and morality, but they, to an even higher extent, are dependent on that society delivering those and reciprocating those morals and values. Whereas a Muslim, we could say, would be capable, if they had access to the teachings, no matter what the state of society, they could dissent and chart their own path, right? Because those principles exist. And then the last thing I would say to that question is, these are creations of God, right? And so it's inevitable that people created with the fitrah of Allah, right, could develop beauty. It's inevitable that any human being, regardless of their disposition to God, God will still shower them with many beautiful qualities. And just as an extension to that, I would say that Allah has no problem giving people good lives in the dunya, regardless of their theological disposition. So this idea that, like, if you turn against God, that your life is going to disintegrate, your worldly life, is, in my opinion, a false assumption. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even says that in the Quran, where He says, من كان يريد الحياة الدنيا وزينتها نوفي إليهم أعمالهم فيها وهم فيها لا يبخسون. Allah says, whoever wants the good of this life, the beauty of this life, نوفي إليهم أعمالهم فيها. We literally give them success in that which they want. And he says, and we will not allow them to suffer any shortage in that. وَهُمْ فِيهَا لَا يُبْخَسُونَ. But then he says, but those individuals in the afterlife will not have anything but the fire, right? So this idea that God is opposed to giving anyone that rejects him, or rather I should say, he's inclined to give people who reject him bad lives, I think is wrong. Really, God gives every human being what they want. That is the general reality of life. If you want the afterlife, you can have the afterlife. If you want this life, you can have it. Anything you want, you will find God to be a facilitator for, right? Whether you believe in him or not. That is the natural order, right? Sunnatullah. It's the sunnah of Allah. So, I guess that is an answer. I hope you took notes, because I think I mentioned like 7 things.
That was great.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I know it's a tough question, because many of us have, seen over the years that, Muslims have been particularly bad at things, and non-Muslims are particularly good at things. And so this kind of inferiority has developed, and we're coming from this country or that country, and and even myself, I lived in Lebanon for years. We couldn't even pick up the trash correctly, right? And then you come here and you're like, whoa, look at this. There's a garbage man. There's this, there's a dump. There's like, right? There's recycling. But if you look at a societal level, though, I mean, America is producing the most carbon emissions, right, that are destroying our environment by a long shot. So, it is confusing world. But really, it's not because Muslims are bad or non-Muslims are good. It's because if you have a weak government, you'll have weak people, right? If you have a strong government, you have an orderly government, you'll have orderly, good citizens, in general, right? And so Muslims, where they happen to be, have suffered through weak governments, and therefore you have undisciplined and weak human beings, regardless of their theology. And so Muslims who feel that Muslims should be better need to understand that they need to create cultures so that the average person who has average himma, average passion, right, can follow them, right? So those of aspiring passion need to create culture so that those who might believe in something good but really need those individuals who are aspiring to lift them up. So if God gives you more, if he inspires you, then you owe it to him and to society to let that trickle down, right? And that's done through culture. And don't ask me a question about trickle down economics just because I said trickle down, even though I love I love that subject. Yeah. So go ahead.
So I have a question that I guess maybe we can think about and chat at another time, whether time's up.
Yeah.
But one thing I've thought about that our discussions are informing this question is, I wonder in the past 100 years how colonization and racism in different places in the world have played a part on the idea of Muslims being carry an importance of private religion at the expense of secularized religion. So that is thinking and using our time and efforts towards education, attainment of wealth, and things like that for the dunya, and kind of a negligent, and in that process, only thinking about private religion, and in that process, forgetting about communal obligations
Yeah.
that we have.
Can you say more?
Yeah, so I mean, even in the example you're talking about in the American context, the American Muslim context, today, and I think especially if you look at immigrant communities, which I'm a part of as well as the Black American experience, we focus on our time on education, school, attainment of status, and I think in that process, when it comes to religion, we stick to the bare minimum, like something that I think came up here. And in doing that, I think we struggle trying to make the scale of Islam bigger so that we actually affect communities. Our own community first, before we can actually affect the American community.
Yeah.
And with struggling to do that, I think we see in our upcoming generation, we struggle with how to balance the two for them. Because they no longer have they don't have any cultural baggage to actually use when it comes to trying to kind of tackle between their identities as Muslims and as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the community culture of Islam is a way to tackle that, but we kind of didn't hold on to it ourselves. We didn't take it forward, and so now we're kind of at a place where it's we'll keep the religion private as long as we can get ahead. Hopefully that will help us to establish ourselves in America. But I think we're seeing that we need to be more communal as Muslims, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea, and it makes a lot of sense. What I would say, though, is that, and this is something I always try to mention on the minbar, is that our American identity is about people of faith, right? Speaking truth. And, I always try to center that, and I did that recently, and I've done it before several times, like Malcolm, Hajj Malik Shabazz, rahimahullah, like Dr. King, etc. That is America, and that's basically what we have to do, is create cultures that show that what is truly American is people of religion. And I would say that's always been the case for most of modernity. And it's only until recently that kind of postmodernity has set in and basically thrown out all senses of tradition and all senses of authority. Although I would say that doesn't really have anything to do with Rawls, though, because I think Rawls does a good job of trying to protect religion. But yeah, I do think that those are all excellent points. And as for colonialism and racism, I mean, we have to talk about that more in depth. But yeah, I would say that colonialism plays a huge part because it is part and parcel to why our parents and grandparents, lived in places with such weak governance, right? And then racism also contributes to this sense of inferiority, right? That we walk around trying to model what we consider to be white behavior, and that we consider that to be civilized and good. And colonized people will always try to emulate and imitate their masters, right, in that sense. So, I mean, those are things that we have to really look at. But at the same time, we do so, recognizing, at least for me, recognizing that our parents were in the middle of wars, and America allowed them to come here and establish lives. So that it's just as Dr. Jackson says, it is a loyal descent. It's not like a condescending descent. It is a sincere wish to improve our condition, rather than dissent and saying, I want nothing to do with you guys, but I'm simply here because I have nothing better. There's no better alternative, and so I'm just going to tolerate you, right? How can we develop more genuine ways to exist and develop culture without that type of condescending attitude, which I think is important. Yeah. So 111, inshallah, let us go for Dhuhr prayer. So we end, inshallah ta'ala, with the remembrance of God. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all on this beautiful day, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may God fill our hearts with passion, with himma al-aliyah, with the highest of inspiration, and give us the knowledge that we need to earn His pleasure through those passions and inspirations, and may we be the builders of divine social infrastructure and culture that enhances all of society and does it from the divine gaze, from our love and seeking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.